Hey guys, it's Courtney. Today I'm here with a very quick video using the Sketch Tulip Bouquet by Simon Says Stamp. So this is a really large image, as you can see. So I'm using my Misty here, lining that up all the way to the right-hand side of my card panel. And this is a piece of Nina Solar White 80-pound cardstock. And I'm going to go ahead and stamp this out with my Blackout ink by Ink on 3 because it is my favorite Copic safe ink. And I did stamp this twice just because it is such a large image. And then I'm going to take a piece of Simon Says Stamp masking paper, just cut down to a little bit larger than that image itself, and stamp that again directly onto that masking paper. And then I'll go ahead and start fussy cutting this out. Now there is a little bit of a gap in between the images or in between the little stems. So once I have the outline of the image cut out, I'm going to cut straight through the image itself in order to get that little gap there so that I have that little opening there. You can definitely cut your mask in half and just use 2 separate masks for one image. But I find for me, it's easier to line up when it's all one if it's not too intricate. So I did go ahead and line this up and mask out my image, and I did have to kind of play around with it a little bit and kind of twist it around just to make sure it did cover up the entire image. For the most part, it doesn't have to be absolutely perfect. Then I'm going to go ahead and do a little bit of ink blending, and I'm using the Magical Plaid stencil by Echo Park and Fossilized Amber Distress Oxide ink. And I like to lay my card panel face down onto my stencil, and I had some stains on my stencil. I thought it was dirty, but it's just stains, so I'm not too worried about it. But I lay my card panel face down and just stick all 4 sides with some Post-it note tape. That way it doesn't shift around when I'm doing my ink blending. Going to use one of my blending brushes here, and I'm starting off all the way to the right hand side and kind of working my way about halfway to the left of my card panel, kind of fading this out to white so that it's going to be really, really faint. It's not going to be all that noticeable. Probably it's very hard to see in pictures, but it's there. I promise that it's there. I'll go ahead and remove my stencil there and that Post-it note tape as well as that mask. Now the Simon Says Stamp masking paper is quite tacky, so I like to take just the tip of my scissors to get it going, to get it started, and then rip up the rest with my fingers. So moving on to the Copic coloring, I'm kept this real nice and simple, starting off with my lightest color to map out the darkest areas. For this top flower here, it's going to be on the outer edges of each of those petals on the outer edges. And for that middle petal that's kind of laying underneath that, there's going to be a shadow on either side where it's laying underneath the first 2 petals. And then for the petals in the back, these aren't going to have much of a highlight to them just because most of them would be in shadow, or at least what we can see would be in shadow. So blending that darkest color out with my darkest midtone, then my lightest midtone, and just leaving the tips of the petals for my lightest color. And I picked my Y08 as my lightest midtone, and totally forgetting that this marker is going dry and I do not yet have a refill for it. So I want all of my flowers to be looking the same. So I took out my Copic chart to try to get something that is very similar. And I didn't have anything. So I had to kind of improvise here, and I had to bring in a 5th color, which I don't normally do, but in order to kind of get the same look as I did for the first flower, I really didn't have much of a choice. So I am again starting off with that lightest color to map out the darkest areas for this particular flower. That front petal, or that main petal, I guess, is just going to have a little bit of shadow up the center of it. And then the ones on the outer edges, we can only see a teeny tiny part of these. So I'm barely touching the marker to the paper with just the very tip, just to add my shadows. And for that darkest color, this is my Scary Dark color, I'm not necessarily adding it to all of the dark areas. as long as I add just a dot or just a small little flick, I will still get that contrast, but there's just not a whole lot of area to work with here. So I didn't want to add too much and not be able to preserve any room for my highlight. So bringing in the Y35 and the Y19 as two of my lighter midtone, or my darker midtones rather, and then bringing in the Y04 still as my lightest color. And this is a pretty bright yellow. So once you go over everything with that Y04, it kind of brightens everything up, and you really can't tell the difference that I used a different color combination than I did for that first flower. So for this smaller one, again, shading is going to be where one petal is laying over another, and then on the outer edges of those front petals. And this is a smaller area, so I'm just using smaller flicks. That way I can fit all 5 of those colors in a smaller area to make them look the same as the other flowers. So for the leaves, I am going to again start off with my lightest color to map out the darkest areas. I am going to be adding shading to the base of the leaves and the tip of the leaves to make these leaves look like they're kind of bowed out a little bit. Also paying attention to where one leaf is hanging behind another, or possibly behind the stem. My darkest color here is a G07, and then I'll switch over to YG markers. So when I switch over to those YG markers, I go over that G07 just to kind of lighten it up a little bit, where you're still going to have the shadow, but it's going to have a little bit of that yellow-green look rather than just plain green. But basically doing the same thing, extending those areas out with my 2 midtones and leaving the center of the leaves for my highlight. Now, I also wanted to announce the winner of the Trinity Stamps $15 gift card for the video that I did a few days ago, and the winner is Bethany Stover. So Bethany, I'm going to go ahead and leave my email address in the description box. If you could just email me with the email address that you want me to use to send that gift card over to you, and I'll get it right over. So moving on next to the stems, and I'm going to switch out I'm going to get rid of the G07 and move into a YG17, which is just not quite as dark, because I wanted to have the stems stand out a little bit from the leaves, even though I want them to be very similar in color. So I'm just concentrating my shading being underneath each of the flowers where the stem is meeting the flower, and then on the base of the stems, also creating a shadow where that one flower is kind of hanging over the middle stem. And then again, finishing off with the lightest color for that highlight area. So moving on to the sentiment, I'm going to be using 2 of the sentiments, stamping these with black dye ink by Simon Says Stamp. I first stamped my first part of the sentiment, which is just one single word. Looked great. Then I ended up stamping out this little quote that is part of the stamp set, and I stamped this real crooked. So we're going to go ahead and fix that just by adding a sentiment strip. But first, I am going to go ahead and adhere this panel down to an A2 size note card, and I am using Tombow Mono Multi Glue, which is obviously a wet glue that adheres fairly quickly. You have a couple of seconds to work it a little bit, but it will pretty much be permanent within about a minute, but it doesn't dry totally instantly. So I want to make sure that I get this panel down onto my card base, put this aside to dry while I work on that sentiment strip. Taking a piece of black cardstock here, treating this with my anti-static tool, and using that same sentiment that I had stamped crooked with Versamark ink, sprinkling on some white embossing powder, and then I'll go ahead and heat set that. Now this is a pretty intricate, I guess you could say, sentiment. There's a lot of fine lines. So I did have a few strands or few little pieces of embossing powder sticking to areas that I didn't want it to stick to. So I just take a very fine dry paintbrush, and honestly I take the one that I use for my liquid masking fluid because it's kind of stiff from that masking fluid, so I find that that works good. So went ahead and heat set that, making sure that my heat gun was heated up before bringing that to the paper. And then I went to cut this down and directly cut right down the center of my sentiment. I don't know what I was thinking here. So I had to flip that piece of black cardstock around, retreat that with my anti-static tool, and restamp it, emboss it, reheat set it, and then I was able to cut it down into a sentiment strip just slightly larger than the sentiment itself. I wanted it a little bit larger just so that it would fit over that crooked sentiment that I had stamped out the first time. So next I'm going to go ahead and take my scissors here, and I'm going to cut along the edges or the right edge of my image. Now you're going to want to make sure that you're using really sharp scissors here because you're cutting through 2 panels, and one of them is probably 110 pound like mine is, and one of them is the 80 pound. So I'm just leaving a small border, and I'm not going to go in between, like in that gap between the leaf and the flower. I don't care if there's a little bit of a gap. I just want to kind of have the basic outline of the image until I reach the top. And this will kind of just give it a little bit of interest. It's a simple card, but this will just give it a little something extra. So once that was done, I will go ahead and pop up my sentiment strip with some Scotch foam tape that I cut down to pretty much the same size as the sentiment strip. I like to make sure, I prefer the foam tape rather than the foam dots or foam squares, just because I don't like to leave any gaps. When you're mailing it, they run it through a machine and it gets squished down, so it's easiest to have the foam go all the way across the sentiment strip. So finally, I'm just going to finish off with a few Nouveau drops, and this is the dandelion yellow, and just add a few of those above my sentiment. So that is it. That is the card for today, guys. Thanks a lot for stopping by. Congratulations, Bethany. I look forward to your email. Have a great day, guys. Bye.